Israel is targeting women and girls directly using systematized reproductive, sexual, and gender-based violence as tools of war. And as a result, maternal morbidity has skyrocketed. Stillbirths have multiplied. Miscarriages have risen by over 300%. Children are now being born with deformities caused by weapons that have poisoned the earth, the air, the water, the very elements that make life possible.
Hi everybody, welcome back to Equals, the fabulous podcast about inequality. I'm Max.
And I'm Grazielli. Hi. Today we're going to talk about such an important subject in the context we're living. We're going to talk about the deep inequality at the heart of peace negotiations.
Yeah, this is quite a side topic for us, but super interesting. So the reason we're doing this bonus episode is because we've got a report coming out on the 16th of October, which is looking at the role of women in peace negotiations. And it's the 25th anniversary of a landmark resolution at the UN on women, peace and security. And it's a fascinating topic, how involving women in peace negotiations makes them work better. So yeah, it's going to be good.
It is. And we have two guests today. One is Dr. Sarah Ihmoud. She's an anthropologist and expert on Palestinian women and decolonial feminism. And Dr. Sanam Naraghi-Anderlini, who is the founder and CEO of ICAN and a former director of London School of Economics Centre for Women, Peace and Security.
And we should say one more thing is that this episode was recorded before the ceasefire was announced. So it's in that context, but I mean, we all hope and pray that the ceasefire holds and we have some kind of peace in Gaza. But it's such a powerful interview. Should we get into it?
Yes, let's do it.
Sanam, we'll come to you first if that's okay. Your research is into peace negotiations and the fact that peace negotiations worldwide work a lot better when women are involved. Can you tell us a bit more about that and how it works?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on the show. And it's a great question. And I feel as if we're back at sort of, university level debate society where every word matters. So the point I think that I want to sort of hone in on is the word meaningfully. Because when you look behind the stats and the sort of quantitative data as they have, which as you is incredibly difficult to actually amass and attribute to determining, is it just because there's a woman there that things get better and so forth? There are many other factors that come into play. But essentially, when we say meaningfully, what it shows and the empirical evidence behind that is in contexts and conflicts where you have had robust women's peace movements. So women's movements that have emerged in the space of demanding peace, being active in communities both at a local level, but also in terms of political negotiations behind the scenes work. Northern Ireland in the 1990s was a case, an example. Somalia in the 1990s, Liberia in early 2000s. When you have, movements of women who are active both in their community level, but also engaged then in the political space and in the negotiations, what they do is, in a way, twofold. On the one hand, they bring the perspectives and issues that are relevant to conflict-affected societies to the table. So it's not just about what the political leaders want. It's what society and their own people are experiencing, whether it's the children, victims, prisoners, etc. So they bring a sort of a human dimension and expand the concept of the agenda of the talks and get into both the root causes on the one hand, so the past, but also the consequences in the future that we want. That's one aspect of substantively and also reframing the discussions. And then when you have the connection between a political process and a civic movement, what happens is that they anchor the peace agreement into society. So again, examples of Northern Ireland in the 90s and then Colombia more recently in 2016 and onward. In both instances, the women's movements were really critical in advocating at a community level, at a societal level, for the referenda to support the peace agreement. At the same time, if they are signatories to the peace agreement, they are then able to hold the other signatories accountable for implementing the commitments that have been made.
You already gave some great examples in there, but do you want to dig into one of them examples a bit more? So, maybe Northern Ireland is a really interesting one. So how would that actually work?
What happened in Northern Ireland was that for years, prior to the Good Friday Agreement. At a community level, Catholic and Protestant women were doing a lot of sort of service-oriented work and dealing with issues like violence at home and domestic childcare for women, going to work, issues that are sort of the bread and butter issues that women live with. What happens with the space that women occupy? There was activism in Catholic and Protestant communities, and then when they came together, when they would cross the divide, they would see that they had more in common as women around their identity and their experiences of life as women than the divisions that had been sort of foisted on them based on religion. Same thing in Rwanda and Burundi, by the way, and Bosnia. That was an important step in the Northern Irish process. Then, there were attempts at peacemaking and so forth during the Blair administration, and Senator Mitchell from the US was appointed as the envoy for the peace talks. And he had an advisor, he had a female advisor in his team. And when he came to Northern Ireland they were thinking about how to design the process, who should be sitting at the tables of negotiation. One of the things that she advised him was that, why not open it up and not just leave it to the major big political parties on either side. So they designed a process where they said, okay, let's have elections. And the top 10 political parties, the top 10 parties that win the most votes, have representation in the peace negotiations. And the women's movement at the time basically realized, okay, this is their opportunity to have a voice in this process. And they went to the other political parties, the major ones and the minor ones, and asked if they would carry their message and be able to sort of, be affiliated with them. And they had a message of social justice, human rights for all, dialogue, and kind of conflict resolution at the core of it. And the political parties rejected them. Nobody was interested in what the women had to say. So they basically decided in a space of 6 weeks to set up a new political party called the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition and run in the elections themselves. They made posters out of cardboard boxes and whatever resources they had, and they used the communities. They went back into the communities that they'd served and the women's networks and spaces that they had served to run for elections. And they came 9th overall in the elections that happened. So they got their seats at the negotiation table. And long stories of being mooed when they walked into the room, you silly cows, state stories of the men in the civic forums and sort of standing up and singing "Stand by your man" and saying that the women were betraying the men. All sorts of sort of really insulting things like that happened along the way. But what these women did was they brought issues of prison reform, police reform, education reform to the tables of negotiations. And when it got to the Good Friday Agreement and the decision was to pause the negotiations, go for a referendum to bring in public buy-in. And again, the women's movement was absolutely critical in kind of going out and advocating and building up public support for the agreement to carry on. What I've often found, the way I see it in the work that I've done over the last 30 years, is that peace processes have a chance of success when you have political will from those who are the warring parties, if you want, and inclusivity from the society. And if you don't have inclusivity, it's really hard for the political negotiations to stick and for them to be held accountable. At the same time, if you only have the public demand for it and you don't have the political will, it's really hard to have a genuine process going, as Israel-Palestine being a classic example more recently.
That's a great segue, an amazing example. Grazie, over to you.
Sarah, the ongoing genocide in Gaza is a real-time example of what is being described. So Palestinian women are having together to document abuses, to negotiate local ceasefires, to feed displaced families with almost no international support. At the same time, they are risking their lives every day for peace in such an unstable and dangerous environment where they can be bombed at any time. Meanwhile, they are remaining disproportionately excluded from negotiating tables. So I would like to know from you if you could describe what you have witnessed taking place in Gaza and the West Bank across the last 2-3 years, and what the cost is for women, for Gaza's future, and for the global stability of ignoring women peace builders in this context.
Yes, thank you so much for the question, and thanks for having me. What we've witnessed over the past 3 years is a brutal colonial war on the Palestinian people that has culminated in genocide in Gaza and is intensifying across all other geographies of occupied Palestine. And at its heart, this genocide is a war against Palestinian women. So, what are the characteristics of this war on women? They are unbearable truths that are devastating to name and sit with, but we have to name them. Thousands of women have been killed, and hundreds of thousands are living in extremely precarious conditions. Conditions, as you mentioned, of Israeli airstrikes on their homes and communities, of multiple forced displacements at this point, the loss of family and community support systems, of months of forced starvation. In March 2025, both Palestinian testimonies and UN findings confirmed what many of us already knew, that Israel is targeting women and girls directly using systematized reproductive, sexual, and gender-based violence as tools of war. In Gaza, Israel has systematically destroyed sexual and reproductive health infrastructure. It has imposed a siege that blocks humanitarian assistance, that denies essential medicines and equipment for safe pregnancies, deliveries, postpartum and neonatal care. And as a result, maternal morbidity has skyrocketed. Stillbirths have multiplied. Miscarriages have risen by over 300%. Children are now being born with deformities caused by weapons that have poisoned the earth, the air, the water, the very elements that make life possible. And starvation as a method of war has deepened these harms. Women are unable to nourish themselves or their children, right? Breastfeeding becomes impossible. And now, as famine grips Gaza, malnutrition is surging and newborn babies are dying. At the same time, we know that women, men, and children have been detained en masse throughout this genocide, that they've been disappeared, they have been systematically raped, humiliated, and sexually abused. And while Gaza is burning, Israel is also accelerating the conditions of ethnic cleansing in the occupied West Bank, including Jerusalem, where the state is annexing Palestinian villages, is empowering and encouraging armed settlers to violently attack Palestinian communities and to colonize our lands. Just 2 summers ago, right before the genocide in Gaza officially began, my own community in the occupied West Bank was brutally invaded by hundreds of settlers from a nearby settlement who terrorized our community, who burned olive trees, who burned our homes and our cars, and attempted to terrify our community into leaving our land, right? So this is happening every day. The military is intensifying its policy of closure, is closing off villages from each other, is deepening the isolation of Palestinian communities and vulnerability to settler violence. They are continuing their policies of mass arrest and detention, including the detention of pregnant Palestinian women who face extremely inhumane conditions. Just a few weeks ago, a woman named Tahani Abu Smihan, who's a teacher and a Palestinian political prisoner, was forced to give birth while shackled in Damon prison. And her son is currently the youngest Palestinian being held captive by Israel. These are not random or isolated acts. They are designed to degrade, to humiliate, and to fracture the collective spirit, dignity, and power of an entire people to resist their annihilation. And the cost for Palestinian women is unbearably high, and we must not look away. We have to understand that this is not a distant tragedy, but it's a wound to our collective humanity. Because when the violation of Palestinian women is normalized, excused, or denied, it signals that gendered terror can be deployed with impunity and that no life is sacred anywhere, right? And until we confront this, no liberation for women, for Palestinian women, for any people anywhere will be complete.
It's so true, Sarah. And in this context that should have been happening, can you share a moment from these past 2 years when women's leadership made the difference between despair and survival?
Yes, thank you. For me, women's leadership is in the streets of Gaza. It's the mothers giving birth amidst airstrikes. The women building and rebuilding home amidst the ruins and the rubble, displacement after displacement. It's the school teachers who are still teaching our children. It's the doctors who are suturing the wounds, the psychologists lending mental health support as trauma intensifies. It's the journalists who are telling our stories under immense threat in order to expose the truth of what's happening. This is women's leadership. This is women's peace building. It's the embodied everyday acts that women perform to care for Palestinian life against all odds. I'm thinking with the story of my friend Shemat, for example, who's a young mother in Gaza who survived multiple displacements, whose home was destroyed by Israeli airstrikes, who lost her first baby to miscarriage after the terror of witnessing an airstrike near her displacement tent, and who continued to care for her second pregnancy under the weight of forced starvation. She delivered her baby as she listened to the sound of bombs falling around her, and now she continues to struggle to survive, to care for her newborn son against all odds. Leadership to me is also in the streets of Jenin, where I met with women at a women's center 2 summers ago who shared their stories of being held captive with their children in their own homes as Israel invaded the camp, who witnessed their family members being shot or arrested, and who told their stories anyway as an act of refusing to be silent and refusing to be isolated in their pain. And I'm also carrying with me the stories of women I met in Egypt this past summer, women displaced from Gaza, right? There are over 100,000 refugees from Gaza displaced in Egypt now, who are struggling to rebuild their lives while dreaming of returning home. I'm thinking of a young mother that I met this summer who had lost all 3 of her children when Israel bombed their home and who continues to live to keep the memory of her children alive. I'm thinking of 3 young girls I visited in a hospital in Cairo who were recovering from wounds they had sustained when airstrikes destroyed their home and began to burn them alive, who had lost their parents in the bombing of their home and who were now caring for each other and continuing to dream of continuing their education. This is leadership to me. It's the daily embodied work of caring for and affirming a future for Palestinian life, which oftentimes women take the leading role in. It's the refusal to be defined by colonial violence, to not allow ourselves to fall into despair. It's the insistence that we will create a world for our children to live in fully as dignified human beings.
Wow. I mean, I can't think of a better example of how women can make a profound difference, both in survival and in these peace negotiations. Sanam, what would meaningful, and again, it's that word meaningful, what would meaningful protection and funding look like for women peace builders? And how does it differ from the actual situation?
Thank you. And I just wanted to thank Sarah for the reflections on Gaza and what's going on with women there and in the West Bank. I just spoke with a colleague of ours in Bethlehem, and she said that she's living in an open prison. There are 54 gates now around the district that she lives in, and a journey that would have taken an hour now takes 10 hours. So we can talk about Palestine statehood, but the reality on the ground is annexation is happening as we speak. In terms of what does meaningful protection and participation and funding look like? Number one is recognition. If you don't recognize that these women exist, then we don't fund them and we don't protect them, basically. So step one is recognition. The protection that they need, as I said, comes from recognition. If you recognize what they're doing and you enable them and you give them voice, it also builds out the protection for them. But it's also an understanding that the types of threats that people encounter when they're doing peace building, especially women when they're doing peace building, is it can be physical, it can be targeting their families or threatening their families, and it can be reputational, accusing them of being spies, accusing them of being unethical, immoral, promiscuous. And then it comes to funding. So the funding aspect is tied to the protection and the recognition issues. And now we have shifted into an environment of militarism and budgets being cut for development, humanitarian, and peace work generally. From a public standpoint and a societal standpoint, mass public standpoint, I can tell you that 10 million pounds that we've spent in the last 10 years around the world, which is the cost of one tank, has done more good and saved more lives and prevented more violence than you can possibly imagine. So imagine if we had $1 billion or $2 billion in the field of conflict prevention and peace building, what a difference it would make.
Yeah, and I would like to go back to you, Sarah. Watching the genocide in Gaza play out on our screens in real time is horrific, to say the least, but our horror alone doesn't create change. And even though some action seems to be starting now from states, it all feels a bit late. So I'm wondering, what reasons do you find to stay hopeful in your work, and what can our listeners do to pressure governments and create change?
Yes, thank you. It is challenging to speak about hope because I think there's a sense by many that to do so risks romanticizing our people's conditions in Gaza or not fully sitting with the immensity of the loss. But my partner reminds me often that hopelessness is also an infrastructure that we have to continue to fight against within our own minds. And so I think as Palestinian women, our relationship to hope is different. It's not a naive or passive expectation of a better future. It's tethered to the daily act of surviving, of remembering, and of dreaming otherwise within and against a system and a structure that is designed to erase Palestinian presence and futurity. So, I want to say a few things about hope. I think hope in this moment for us is a refusal of settler logics and genocidal futures. It's the collective grounded act of insisting that another future is not only possible but necessary, and committing ourselves to act in whatever way we have the capacity to do so, to continue to bring that future into existence. Another way of thinking about hope is, I think for us now, it's interconnectedness with grief and rage, right? Our feminist traditions do not separate hope from grief. Hope is not sanitized. It weeps, it aches, and still it continues to love, right? Hope in the face of genocide is not the erasure of our pain. It is the decision to make meaning out of our pain and to continue to fight for life, even when the world tells us that we are disposable as a people. And hope is also, I think, kinship across geographies of struggle, right? Our relationships with each other. Our histories teach us that hope is rooted in relationality, not charity or saviorism. That Gaza is not separate from Ferguson, from Standing Rock, from the Congo, from the Sudan. These are interconnected struggles against militarism, anti-Blackness, environmental degradation, and other forms of colonial domination. And we see that hope embodied in the thousands of people taking to the streets to share their love with Palestine, right? From Mexico to Italy to the various people joining the flotillas that are attempting to break the siege. And I love what Alexis Pauline Gumbs has to say about hope. She says something like, hope is a kind of kinship with the not yet. It becomes the tender, fierce act of witnessing and also showing up out of a shared desire for another kind of world, right? A world and a future that we have not even begun to be able to imagine yet.
That's beautifully put. I mean, that final answer there was just so moving. I hope we can find some kind of hope. Is there anything you feel we haven't covered or things you'd quite like to say differently? You were both amazing. You've clearly done this many times before and were super professional, but is there anything you'd like to add?
Thank you. I just wanted to, as a reminder of how women perceive and imagine these issues differently, I wanted to, if it's possible, to share with you just a short extract from a statement that was made in 2002 to the Security Council, marking the second anniversary of Resolution 1325. And it was a time when the second intifada was going on in Palestine, and there were huge crackdowns. I was actually there not long after, and it was, curfew time and so forth. And civil society, Israeli and Palestinian civil society that had worked together prior to that period, there was a real breakage, and they weren't working together because of the power imbalances. But specific Israeli and Palestinian women continued to speak together and appear together in public. And one of them was a woman called Terry Greenblatt, who led a Israeli women's peace organization. And if it's possible, I would like to share with you just an extract of what she said to the Security Council at that time, if that's okay. She said, you need us because we've developed a process and socio-political fluency that keeps authentic and productive dialogue moving forward, even as the violence escalates and both sides continue to terrorize one another. Women's characteristic life experiences gives us the potential for two things: a very special kind of intelligence, social intelligence, and a very special kind of courage, social courage. We have developed the courage to cross the lines of difference drawn between us, which are also the lines drawn inside our heads, and the intelligence to do so safely, without a gun or a bomb, and to do it productively. And most importantly, we're learning to shift our positions, finding ourselves moving towards each other, without tearing out our roots in the process. Even when we are women whose very existence and narrative contradicts each other, we will talk, we will not shoot. And then she goes on, but I just wanted to share this to show that this is what we were saying, people were saying 23 years ago to the Security Council. And if they had been listened to, and if they had been put as the lead advisors, if you want, or if we had allowed women to lead the design of the processes that we have, we would be in a very different place, I think.
Thank you. Wonderful.
If I could just say something, thank you, Sanam. I really find this profound and necessary to discuss. And at the same time, I think even in the voice that you just elevated, this idea of both sides coming to the table and women from various positionalities coming to lead peace negotiations is vital, but at the same time, it masks the structural differences between our lives as coming from colonial communities or colonizer communities and colonized communities. And we cannot look away from the structural injustice that sits between us as women. And until we actually address the root cause of this structure of genocide, of violence, there can be no working together across the table and sitting at the same side of the table. I think Palestine exposes the inadequacy of the women, peace, and security agenda. The core goals cannot be realized while Palestinian women and our leaders are systematically detained without charge or trial, silenced in political and civic spheres, and criminalized for defending our rights, right? These goals are hollow while women in Gaza struggle each day to survive the ongoing violence of genocide. Much like, these goals of women coming together from both sides of the colonial divide are hollow unless we actually allow ourselves to address the root causes of this structure of violence. We have to name this clearly, right? Too many initiatives aim not merely to expand Palestinian political participation, but to fold Palestinian life into a global architecture that keeps us captive. They work at the edges while leaving intact the structural gendered violence that makes participation of women at the table of peacekeeping possible only in theory, right? What oftentimes these liberal peace agendas fail to confront is the root cause of the oppression of Palestinian women. What we have to keep claiming is a single demand: an end to the genocide, the dismantling of this settler colonial project, and the conditions necessary for Palestinian liberation. This is the only pathway to peace.
Yeah, just one point, Sarah. The point isn't to be part of the liberal agenda. The point is actually to supersede that. What we're saying with the agenda is that the processes that we have in and of themselves are going to be failed and flawed until and unless we actually have voices like yours in the process to redesign it.
Thank you, both of you. I mean, that was such a powerful interview from so many directions. And I think our listeners are going to find it absolutely fascinating.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much, Sanam. I've learned so much from you as well. And I appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Wow, that was quite a hard interview in many ways and really thought-provoking. What really stuck out for you, Grazie?
Well, for me, it was how they rebuilt the concept that I had for hope. And I can imagine that for many of you who are listening, because when Dr. Sarah said that hope is a decision to make meaning out of our pain, that was so impactful for me. Because we tend to think that hope is kind of a naive feeling on what to expect from the future. But no, it's actually a decision and insisting that another future is possible and taking action. So that's it for me.
Yes, I thought that answer on hope was amazing. I think for me, the thing that stood out was that, that back and forth at the end. When we were talking about women in Northern Ireland and the Northern Irish peace process, and you could think of Catholic women and Protestant women on either side of the divide, realizing that they had more in common and helping to bring things together, that made a lot of sense to me. But then when Dr. Sarah, raised her issues with it in terms of Gaza, Palestine, Israel, and how much harder really it is to imagine Israeli women and Palestinian women coming together when there's, in some ways, even a much bigger divide, a colonial divide, a divide of, enormous proportions. It is harder to picture it. But I think the general point that if you can get people on either sides of a peace negotiation to see that they have more in common than divides them, and the pivotal role that women can play in that, I think that is such a powerful thing, and a thing that mustn't be forgotten. That stood out for me.
Yes, absolutely. And if you want to read more about this topic, Oxfam is releasing a report on this subject and exposing how global promises towards securing women's leadership in peace and security building is collapsing at the moment. We are going to put on the description of this episode the link for the report.
Yeah, do you have a read? And if you found this episode interesting, hope you did, spread the word. Tell your friends, your family, your mild acquaintances, people in the street maybe, that they should all listen to Equals, and it will make their lives much, much more interesting. And you can find us on @equalshope on X, if you ever go on X anymore. It's a bit of a ghost town.
But we are in other places.
We're in all the other places too. And most importantly, you can sign up for our Substack, which is equals.inc, INK. And that's a really easy way to stay in touch. And we send out a bulletin on all things to do with inequality, short and sharp, every couple of weeks. And it's written by our colleague Alex, and it's super good. So if you do one thing, do that.
It's such a great newsletter. Please make sure you sign it at equals.inc. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, everyone. Speak to you next time.